Imagine a teenage king with the power to unite Europe, smarter than his enemies, bolder than the church, and more legitimate than the crown-stealing thugs who murdered him. Now imagine he's erased from history. No monuments, no glory, just a vanished name, buried by popes, propaganda, and fear. This is the true story of Conradin, the medieval king who could have changed everything if he hadn't lost his head. And once you hear what really happened, you'll never see the Middle Ages the same way again. If you think modern politicians can be forgettable, wait till you meet the medieval king history barely mentions, but absolutely should. Imagine a ruler who had the brains, the bloodline, and the brutal ambition to reshape Europe. Someone who could have toppled empires, reformed kingdoms, and maybe even altered the Crusades. Instead, his name's a historical footnote, tucked between wars, plagues, and far noisier monarchs. We're talking about Conradin, last of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Born in 1252, dead by 17. His story is so buried, most people confuse him with a German shepherd or a Renaissance painter. But here's the thing, Conradin wasn't just some noble kid who got in over his head. He was a legit heir to the Holy Roman Empire and King of Jerusalem by birthright. The guy had credentials. And in the chaotic political blender of 13th century Europe, that made him more than just interesting, it made him dangerous. Let's rewind. The 1200s were a mess. Europe was a spaghetti plate of rival claims, papal power grabs, and dynasties trying to outmaneuver each other like it was a medieval version of Survivor. At the center of it all was the Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of territories stretching from northern Italy through Germany. It wasn't exactly united, more like a messy family reunion where everyone hated each other but shared a crest. Enter Conradin. He was the grandson of Emperor Frederick II, one of the most brilliant and controversial rulers of the Middle Ages. Frederick was part warrior, part scholar, part snake. He battled popes, wrote treatises, and even spoke Arabic. When he died in 1250, his empire crumbled like stale bread, and his enemies smelled blood. Conradin, still in diapers, inherited the Hohenstaufen claim. And that made him a threat. The papacy, particularly under Pope Urban IV and Clement IV, hated the Hohenstaufens. Why? Because Frederick II had made a career of slapping down papal authority and running his empire like it was his personal chessboard. The church wanted his line gone. For good. So when Conradin came of age, the papacy didn't just ignore him, they tried to erase him. They backed Charles of Anjou, a French prince and brother of King Louis IX, to swoop in and take the kingdom of Sicily, which had been Hohenstaufen turf for decades. And Charles? He wasn't subtle. He landed in southern Italy with a mercenary army and a papal blessing, ready to liberate the kingdom. Now, here's where the stakes shoot through the roof. Conradin, just 15, decides to fight back. Think about that. Most 15-year-olds today are worried about exams or acne. Conradin raised an army to challenge the Pope's hand-picked king. And this wasn't just a tantrum, it was a full-blown campaign across the Alps, into Italy, gathering support from loyalists, rebels, and nobles who still clung to the Hohenstaufen dream. In a very real sense, this was a war for the soul of Europe. If Conradin had won, he might have restored imperial authority in Italy, challenged papal supremacy, and kept the Hohenstaufens in the game. Instead of a fragmented, papal-dominated Italy, we might have seen a centralized imperial state decades ahead of its time. That's not just alternate history, that's tectonic shift. And the signs looked good, at first. As he marched south, Conradin was greeted like a returning messiah. Cities opened their gates. Nobles pledged swords. Even the weather seemed to favor him. It was like watching a teen underdog rallying a rebellion that no one thought possible. Modern comparison. Picture Greta Thunberg not just speaking at the UN, but marching into Brussels with a battalion and taking on the European Commission. It's that level of shock. But, and there's always a but, in medieval history, Conradin made a fatal error. He underestimated Charles. The two armies clashed in August 1268 at the Battle of Tagliacozzo. Conradin's forces had the numbers and the morale. But Charles pulled a dirty trick straight out of the medieval playbook, a fake retreat. He hid his elite knights, let Conradin's forces think they'd won, then ambushed them from the rear. Classic bait and smash. The battle was a bloodbath. Conradin fled but was captured weeks later. And here's where things go from tragic to chilling. Charles didn't just imprison him. He put the teenage king on trial for treason. Never mind that Conradin had a stronger claim to Sicily than Charles ever did. The trial was a farce, the verdict pre-decided. On October 29, 1268, in the Piazza del Mercato in Naples, Conradin was publicly beheaded. 17 years old. The last male Hohenstaufen. Executed not on a battlefield, but on a scaffold, like a common criminal. Witnesses said he dropped a glove as a final act of defiance. Maybe it was symbolic. Maybe it was accidental. Either way, it was the death knell of a dynasty. And that's where things should have changed, but didn't. Conradin's death handed Charles control of southern Italy and paved the way for increased papal meddling in secular rule. Instead of reform or reunification, Italy slid deeper into chaos. More city-states. More wars. More popes playing kingmaker. The weirdest part? Conradin became a martyr in some circles, immortalized in German ballads and romantic paintings centuries later. But politically, he vanished. No monuments. No state legacy. Just a what-if. And yet, he's the kid who could have changed everything. So how did Europe react to this royal teenager's execution? And why didn't anyone rise up in vengeance? Let's dig into the fallout and the eerie silence that followed. You'd think the public execution of a teenage king, legitimate heir to one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, would spark riots, revolts, maybe even a crusade. But when Conradin's head hit the block in Naples, the world barely blinked. No uprisings. No royal vengeance. Just eerie silence. It was like Europe exhaled, looked away, and moved on. Why? Because Conradin's death wasn't just the end of a boy, it was the triumph of a very deliberate strategy. Pope Clement IV and Charles of Anjou hadn't simply wanted to defeat Conradin. They wanted to erase him. Kill the body, erase the name, destroy the dynasty. And for a while, it worked. After Conradin's execution, Charles wasted no time. He took control of the Kingdom of Sicily, which included most of southern Italy at the time. But instead of a peaceful consolidation, he ruled like a foreign occupier. Heavy taxes. Brutal repression. French officials replacing local lords. He squeezed the region dry to fund more wars, including dreams of expanding into Byzantium. The guy was less a king, more a medieval imperialist. And the people? They suffered. Commoners who'd once cheered Conradin now lived under a foreign boot. Nobles who'd backed the Hohenstaufen cause were exiled, executed, or stripped of land. Southern Italy became a pressure cooker. But here's the twist, even with all this resentment, no one dared rise up, yet. In the north, the Holy Roman Empire was paralyzed. The throne was technically vacant. German princes couldn't agree on a successor, and the imperial authority fractured even further. Conradin had been the last real shot at reunifying the empire with its Italian holdings. Without him, the old imperial dream began to rot. Meanwhile, the papacy was riding high. Pope Clement IV treated Conradin's death like a divine victory, proof that God backed papal supremacy over secular pretenders. He even denied Conradin a Christian burial. That's how deep the grudge ran. Forget mercy, this was damnatio memoriae in action. But behind the scenes, things were less stable. Charles of Anjou was unpopular almost everywhere but Rome. His French troops looted freely. His tax collectors were hated. And his ambition was starting to look like overreach. Even Pope Clement, who'd once cheered him on, began to worry. But then Clement died in 1268, just weeks after Conradin's execution. That left Charles in an awkward spot. He'd killed a legitimate king, seized a kingdom, and lost his biggest papal supporter. For a moment, his enemies had an opening. But no one moved. Why? Because fear works. Charles had proven he'd decapitate children if it meant keeping power. It's not that Conradin had no sympathizers. In fact, legends of his bravery began to spread, especially in German lands. Ballads told of his youth, his courage, and his tragic fate. He became a symbol of lost glory, but symbols don't win wars. The Hohenstaufen line was truly extinguished. No cousins waiting in the wings. No secret heirs. Just a void. And in medieval politics, voids don't stay empty, they get filled. Fast. Charles used the next few years to plant his influence deeper. He secured titles, married off allies, and positioned himself as a new Mediterranean power broker. He was eyeing Sicily, Greece, even Constantinople. And without Conradin, who was left to stop him? And yet, there were cracks forming, ones that Conradin might have exploited had he lived. The Sicilian population, mostly of Norman and Arabic descent, hated their new French overlords. Tensions rose in Palermo and Messina. Stories of French soldiers assaulting locals spread like wildfire. Taxes doubled, then tripled. The peasantry starved. The nobility grumbled. And under the surface, revenge simmered. Modern analogy. Think of it like a corporate takeover gone horribly wrong. A foreign CEO sweeps in, fires the board, guts the company, and doubles everyone's workload, then wonders why morale's low. That was Charles in Sicily. Conradin's death may have silenced the resistance, but it didn't kill the rage. And in just 14 years, that pressure would explode in one of the most violent uprisings of the medieval era, the Sicilian Vespers. But we're not there yet. Right now, Charles believed he'd won. The papacy was his ally. The empire was disorganized. His enemies were dead or in hiding. He ruled from Naples like a miniature emperor. He even got himself crowned king of Albania. Yes, really. Because when you think you're unstoppable, geography stops mattering. And this is where the missed potential of Conradin becomes so painfully obvious. Had Conradin lived, had he won that battle, he might have not only kept Sicily but pulled northern Italy back under imperial control. He had German support, noble backing, and legitimate bloodlines. With time, he could have married strategically, forged alliances, and rebuilt the Hohenstaufen influence brick by brick. Instead, we got Charles of Anjou, a French thug in royal robes, propped up by a papal vendetta and held in place by fear. But the story doesn't end there. What happens when a king rules without love? When his kingdom boils with resentment? When a people quietly yearn for the boy king they watched die? We'll dive into the long shadow of Conradin, how his memory refused to die, and how it sparked an uprising so brutal it made kings tremble. If Charles of Anjou thought executing Conradin would be the end of trouble, he sorely miscalculated. Because sometimes, killing a boy creates a martyr. And martyrs have a nasty habit of echoing through history. Within a generation, Conradin's ghost would rise, not in a battlefield, but in the streets, kitchens, and churches of Sicily. And when it did, it would explode in one of the bloodiest uprisings the medieval world had ever seen. The Sicilian Vespers. But before the knives came out, there was silence. An oppressive, aching silence. After Conradin's execution in 1268, southern Italy slipped into a strange kind of limbo. The people hated their French overlords. The nobles grumbled in private. But open rebellion? Too risky. Charles of Anjou had made it clear, defiance was fatal. Still, you can't suppress anger forever. The French occupation became unbearable. Taxes skyrocketed. Local traditions were stomped out. French officials replaced Sicilian elites. And worst of all, the occupying soldiers treated the locals like dirt. Public beatings, property seizures, even sexual violence, all went unpunished. Every humiliation was like tinder waiting for a match. And that match struck in Palermo, during Easter week, 1282, 14 years after Conradin's death. It started small. On March 30th, outside the Church of the Holy Spirit, a French soldier harassed a Sicilian woman. Her husband intervened. Voices rose. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, someone plunged a blade into the Frenchman. He collapsed. Dead. What followed was pure carnage. In minutes, the crowd turned on every French soldier in sight. Within hours, the entire city erupted. Bells rang, not for mass, but for war. Sicilian men, women, even children hunted down the French occupiers with terrifying efficiency. It was like the island had been holding its breath for over a decade, and now it exhaled fire. The massacre spread like wildfire. Within 6 weeks, nearly every Frenchman on the island was dead. Some estimates claim over 8,000 were killed. No mercy. No prisoners. The French language itself became a death sentence. If you couldn't pronounce Cicerai, the local word for chickpeas, you died on the spot. That's not just rebellion. That's surgical ethnic cleansing, medieval style. And behind it all, Conradin's name kept surfacing. Not officially, there was no banner with his face. But in the whispered legends, in the songs, in the minds of angry men, he was the boy they should have followed. The king who died trying to stop this tyranny. He was the what-if made flesh. And now, in death, he was the cause. It's easy to dismiss medieval revolts as chaotic riots, but the Vespers were calculated. The Sicilians didn't just rise up, they reached out. To Peter III of Aragon, who had a claim to Sicily through marriage to Conradin's cousin. This wasn't just rage. It was strategy. Peter landed on the island with an army, accepted the Sicilian crown, and officially split the kingdom of Sicily into two. The island ruled by Aragon, the mainland still clutched by Charles. The old Hohenstaufen territories were now contested again. The dream Conradin died for was clawing its way back to life. Modern comparison. Think of it like a country overthrowing a puppet regime, and then crowning a rival government from exile. It's revolution with receipts. Charles of Anjou, caught completely off guard, scrambled to respond. But his resources were stretched. His allies were nervous. And worse, his reputation had been torched. Even the new pope, Martin IV, was uneasy. Publicly, he excommunicated Peter of Aragon. Privately, he probably wondered if backing Charles had been a cosmic mistake. Because the Vespers weren't just a local revolt, they kicked off the War of the Sicilian Vespers, a decades-long conflict that dragged in France, Aragon, the papacy, and dozens of smaller states. What started as a street stabbing turned into a pan-European crisis. All of it, traceable to the moment a 17-year-old's head hit the scaffold in Naples. And here's the ironic twist: Conradin, in death, achieved what he couldn't in life. He ignited the collapse of Angevin control. He ruined Charles's legacy, and he forced the Mediterranean's major powers into a reshuffle that would ripple for generations. Even culturally, his myth bloomed. In German territories, Conradin became a romantic symbol of innocence slaughtered by tyranny. In Sicily, he was the royal spirit wronged by foreign boots. Ballads, plays, and eventually operas kept his name alive long after his enemies crumbled to dust. You know how modern revolutions often invoke figures like Che Guevara, faces on flags, shirts, murals? Conradin was that, but medieval. A teenage rebel king turned icon, weaponized by memory. And memory, as it turns out, is more dangerous than any army. But while the Vespers shattered Charles's grip, they didn't bring peace. Sicily remained contested. The papacy flailed. And Italy, once again, fragmented. We'll follow the chaos that followed, how the vacuum left by Conradin and the Hohenstaufens sucked Europe into decades of bloodshed, betrayal, and missed chances. When Conradin's head fell, it wasn't just a boy who died, it was the last thread tying together a fragile vision of a united Europe. Without him, the medieval map unraveled faster than a monk's temper during Lent. And after the Sicilian Vespers turned revenge into full-scale war, that unraveling became a blood-soaked free-for-all. Charles of Anjou never recovered. His dream of ruling a Mediterranean empire shattered on the shores of Sicily. His hold on Naples slipped into paranoia and desperation. He died in 1285, the same year as his nemesis Peter of Aragon, but not before watching his legacy reduced to smoldering ruins. The once mighty Angevin project collapsed under the weight of its own ambition, and the ghost of a boy king they tried to erase. But the war didn't die with him. The War of the Sicilian Vespers, triggered by that single Easter spark, dragged on for 20 more years. France, Aragon, the papacy, and dozens of regional factions each clawed for influence over the remains of the Sicilian kingdom. And no one could keep a grip. Alliances flipped like coins. Mercenaries pillaged with impunity. Popes excommunicated faster than they could replace their ink. Italy, especially southern Italy, became a chessboard soaked in blood. And the Holy Roman Empire? Still a fractured joke. With no Hohenstaufen heir, German princes did what they did best: squabble, scheme, and elect puppet kings with all the charisma of boiled cabbage. The empire was an empire in name only, a patchwork quilt of petty dukedoms held together by feudal duct tape. If Conradin had lived, that vacuum might never have formed. He had the charisma to unify, the legitimacy to command loyalty, and the backing to restore real imperial authority, not just in Germany and Italy, but across the Alps. He was a linchpin, and without him, Europe split into smaller and smaller pieces, the kindling for centuries of conflict. Let's not forget, the papacy, too, suffered from its victory. Sure, they got rid of the Hohenstaufen line, but at what cost? Popes went from spiritual leaders to scheming political operatives. Every new pope was dragged into endless Italian wars. By the early 1300s, the papal court had fled Rome entirely, setting up shop in Avignon under French influence. They called it the Avignon papacy, but it might as well have been the church in exile. Conradin's death, and the chaos that followed, exposed just how fragile papal power really was when it leaned too hard into politics. Instead of spiritual dominance, the church found itself bankrupt, besieged, and morally suspect. The seeds of the Reformation? Some were planted right here, in this mess. Meanwhile, Sicily, now under Aragonese rule, was hardly a utopia. Though the island celebrated its liberation, the new regime wasn't exactly soft. The Aragonese had their own agendas, their own taxes, and their own power plays. The people traded one master for another. Sound familiar? And yet, through it all, the memory of Conradin lingered. Not just as a symbol, but as a measuring stick. What if he'd lived? Became the political version of, what if the Beatles never broke up? A haunting hypothetical that made every petty war and botched alliance feel like a second-rate sequel. Modern comparison. It's like losing a young, visionary leader before they hit their stride. Think JFK before Dallas. Or Princess Diana before Paris. The legend grows precisely because the reality was cut short. And every time things fall apart, people look back and say, maybe he could have fixed this. In fact, some 14th century chroniclers started referring to the Hohenstaufen curse, the idea that Europe's chaos was divine punishment for executing Conradin. That's how deep his absence ran. Kings don't usually get that kind of posthumous credit unless their death really did change things. And change it did. Because while Conradin's story faded from royal charters and official scrolls, it thrived in art, literature, and folklore. He became a cautionary tale, a teenage king destroyed by older, colder men. A symbol of youthful justice snuffed out by cynicism. And for a Europe struggling with corruption, war, and moral drift, that image hit home. The irony. Had Conradin lived, he might not have been the golden ruler people imagined. He might have been ruthless. He might have failed. But he never got the chance. And that vacuum, that untested potential, is what gave his legend power. By the 15th century, the name Conradin still carried weight in parts of Germany and Italy. Secret societies invoked his cause. Pretenders claimed distant descent. Even the Renaissance, with its obsession for lost glory, briefly resurrected him as a tragic hero, like a medieval Hamlet but real, and with fewer soliloquies. So as the century turned, and Europe barreled toward new empires, new discoveries, and new disasters, one thing remained unchanged: the gaping hole where Conradin might have stood. And that brings us to the final turn. How did the world remember him? And what does his ghost say about the way we write and erase history? Let's pull the curtain back one more time. In the centuries after his death, Conradin became more than a ghost. He became a litmus test. For rulers, for rebels, and for the record keepers of history. The boy who should have ruled ended up ruling something else entirely, the imagination of a fractured continent. But make no mistake, this wasn't just nostalgia. The way Conradin was remembered, forgotten, and reimagined tells us more about medieval power than any battle or treaty. Immediately after his death, his enemies tried to erase him completely. The papal court scrubbed references to him from official records. Charles of Anjou destroyed coins bearing his name. Monuments to his dynasty were defaced or demolished. Even his burial was denied Christian rites. He wasn't just killed, he was erased. And yet, he persisted. Because the thing about brutal silencing is that it rarely sticks. Conradin's memory survived not in royal archives, but in whispers, songs, and stories passed around taverns, monasteries, and battle camps. German poets called him the last knight of Christendom. Sicilian mothers invoked his name as a curse against tyrants. And in secret, some noble houses kept miniature portraits of him, a teenager in armor, staring defiantly toward a future he never reached. In Naples, where he was executed, public sentiment slowly shifted. By the 14th century, Even Charles's successors couldn't stop the growing reverence for the boy they tried to erase. A small chapel was built on the site of his beheading. Later, a tomb. And eventually, a monument, not sponsored by kings, but by locals who remembered. And here's the twist. The longer Europe stumbled through war, corruption, and fragmentation, the more romantic Conradin seemed. He became a blank canvas. Reformers imagined him as a just monarch. Nationalists painted him as a proto-German hero. Catholics saw a martyr. Revolutionaries saw a victim of elite suppression. But Conradin was none of those things. He was a teenager with a title, an army, and a claim. What he could have been, well, that's the real power of forgotten kings. They become vessels for whatever the present needs. Modern example. Think of how different generations reinterpret figures like Joan of Arc or Anne Boleyn. Each era projects its hopes and fears onto them. The same happened to Conradin. Only this time, the real man was forgotten while the symbol grew. And while statues and legends are fine, the real tragedy is this. Conradin represented a genuine turning point in medieval Europe. He could have ended papal interference in secular rule. He could have stabilized Italy. He could have brought a stronger, more coherent German imperial system that predated the chaos of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War. But the world wasn't ready for a boy king with that much power, especially one who didn't play by the script written by Rome and France. So they cut off his head. And in doing so, they didn't just kill a king, they killed a possibility. A vision. A moment where history could have zigged instead of zagged. His death reminds us that history isn't written by the victors, it's curated by them. Edited. Sanded down. Stories like Conradin's aren't forgotten because they're unimportant. They're forgotten because they're inconvenient. He was a threat to the order that followed. So his memory had to go. Until now. Because here we are, 7.5 centuries later, still saying his name. Still asking, what if? Still digging through the silence for something real. Conradin didn't change history. But maybe remembering him can. So what do we really remember? A teenage boy who stood up to kings and popes, only to be silenced before his story could even begin. Conradin's death didn't just mark the end of a dynasty, it was a warning. That legitimacy can be ignored. That history can be rewritten. And that sometimes, the biggest what if in history is just a name we were told to forget. But what if he had won? Would Europe be unified centuries earlier? Would the Church have lost its political stranglehold? Would the Reformation have happened at all? Drop your theories in the comments. What do you think Conradin could have changed? And if medieval justice, betrayal, and forgotten power grabs fascinate you as much as they do us, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because there's more buried history waiting to be unearthed, and we're just getting started.